when we look at this story, Jesus comes to the grave of Lazarus. And Lazarus has been dead 4 days. And when Jesus gets to the grave, the first thing he says is, Father, I thank thee. He's standing in the cemetery giving thanks. I'm going to talk for a few minutes about giving thanks in the midst of a dead situation. Giving thanks in the midst of a dead situation. You know, I've learned that life is a mixture of good and bad. And as sure as you're sitting here today, you're going to experience the bitter and the sweet that life has to offer. And usually we think of giving thanks when we're enjoying the sweetness of life. And it's easy to give thanks when things are going well, when you're happy, when you feel like you're being blessed. But what happens to your thanksgiving when you end up in a bad situation? What happens to your thanksgiving when you're hurting? What happens to your thanksgiving when you leave the cemetery? Where is that thanksgiving when you're laying up in a hospital room? It's easy to give thanks when things are going well. But what happens to your thanksgiving when you find yourself in the midst of a dead situation? And everything around us seems to be dying. It seems like our community is dying. It seems like our nation is dying. It seems like our economy is dying. Even the church is on life support. And what happens when you know you love the Lord? When you know you ought to give God some thanks. When you want to give God thanks. But you find yourself facing a dead situation. And you end up asking yourself, how can I give thanks when my health is failing? How can I give thanks when my marriage is falling apart? How can I give thanks when I got a child in trouble? How can I give thanks when I can't find a job and don't know how I'm going to pay the bills? You want to give thanks. And you know you ought to give thanks. But you find yourself in a dead situation. And you come to church and you see other folk giving thanks. But you just can't feel the Spirit because you find yourself in a dead situation. I wonder, has anybody here today ever been in a dead situation? But Jesus here in this 11th chapter shows us how to give thanks in the midst of a dead situation. You all know the story of Mary and Martha and her brother Lazarus. Jesus often stayed at their house when he was in town. Jesus ate many meals at their table. But one day Lazarus got sick. And his condition took a turn for the worse. And so they sent for Jesus. Because they knew that Jesus could open blind eyes. They knew that Jesus could unstop deaf ears. They knew that Jesus could make the lame to walk and the dumb to talk. And they knew that if anybody could help Lazarus, it was Jesus. And so they sent for Jesus. And Jesus was only 2 miles away from Bethany. Yet he waits 4 days before coming to check on his friend Lazarus. And then after 4 days, he tells his disciples, let us now go unto Judea. And so now Jesus shows up 4 days after the funeral. 4 days after the body has been committed to the ground. 4 days after the funeral home has been paid. And y'all know they don't give reimbursement back. I don't know anybody yet that's got a refund. And usually when Jesus comes to their house, it's normally a happy occasion. He's always been greeted at the door with hugs and kisses and a pan of water to wash his dusty feet. But this time when Jesus shows up, nobody meets him at the door. There are no warm embraces for him. There's no water to wash his feet. No meal has been prepared for Jesus. Not this time. This house that's always been filled with joy when Jesus comes around, but now Jesus stepped into a dead situation. And then Martha speaks out of her pain. And through her tears, she begins to chastise Jesus. And said, Lord, if you had been here, if you had just been here, my brother would not have died. And Jesus reminds her that I am the resurrection. He that believeth in me, though he were dead, yet shall he live. And sometimes Jesus has to remind us. Sometimes he lets us go hungry to remind us that he'll feed us. Sometimes he lets us get sick to remind us that he's a healer. Sometimes he lets a door get shut in your face to remind you that he's a way out of no way. And he says to Martha, Martha, tell me, where have you laid him? And the Bible says when they get to the graveside, Jesus weeps. This is the same Jesus that made the heavens and the earth. This is the Jesus that cooled the flames one day in a fiery furnace. This is the same Jesus with all power in his hand. He was divine enough to open blind eyes, but at the same time, he was human enough to cry. And Jesus took on our humanity so that he could feel what we feel. Jesus feels your hurt. Jesus feels your pain. And Jesus stands there and looks at the grave of Lazarus. And then Jesus says, take away the stone. Now I'm sure all those standing around began to wonder, what is Jesus going to do now? After all, he's been dead for 4 days. 4 days without a breath of fresh air. 4 days without a sip of water. 4 days without a morsel of bread to eat. Even his own sister said, Jesus, wait a minute. He's getting beginning to stink right now. You don't want to open that grave up. But Jesus was getting ready to restore Lazarus. And there was a stone in the way.